Hi everybody. Welcome back to, the Twilight Zone. Or at least it's starting to feel that way, right? Now, it is interesting that we seem to be collectively experiencing many common themes. Now, hopefully that does include appreciating the added time that you now get to spend with your family members and loved ones. So hopefully you are appreciating those relationships. At the same time, those relationships can cause us stress. So I know that many of us are experiencing heightened levels of frustration over the current circumstances and added anxiety and maybe even some depression, particularly from the economic impact that is soon to follow the current circumstances. I can admit that I have found myself grinding my teeth and biting my nails way too much watching some of those federal updates on the pandemic. And this is day one of what is supposed to be a 30-day, essentially a lockdown or some sort of quarantine, right? So for all we know, we're just at the beginning of this storm. But we'll get through it together. Now, what I wanted to discuss today was how best to cope with this quarantine, with these circumstances that we have found ourselves in, where we're essentially trapped in our homes with our loved ones. So I know that a lot of folks tend to remedy stress with either alcohol or cannabis, and a lot of folks have access to both. So what I wanted to discuss today were the effects of using either and the relative trade-offs for dealing with stress and depression and so forth. So we all know that alcohol is toxic. In fact, it causes damage to almost every major bodily organ to the point that it induces death. And we all know that, or at least should know, that alcohol is incredibly damaging to the developing fetus. Now, these are two outcomes that we don't tend to find with regard to long-term or heavy cannabis usage. In fact, at this point, there are several meta-analyses that have shown that long-term cannabis usage, so folks that have even smoked joints heavily, regularly, every day, for 20 years, don't seem to show long-term damage to their lungs or other major bodily organs. And at this point, we are not aware of any fetal cannabis syndrome. So, stark damage that cannabis causes on the developing fetus. So certainly I'm not advocating for cannabis usage during pregnancy, but we're just not observing these effects, which in theory we should see them with so many folks using cannabis, if they did exist, right? I could also bring up research that shows that when people are granted access to either medical or recreational cannabis through changes in prohibition laws, that a few things occur. So one is that there are significant reductions in the amount of suicides that take place. So essentially, people seem to be substituting their alcohol for cannabis in ways that significantly reduce their depression. And obviously, that's a great thing, right? Another thing that takes place is that people tend to engage in less car accidents and particularly fatal alcohol-related car accidents. So essentially, when people are granted access to either medical or recreational cannabis, they tend to drink and drive less often. And certainly that is an amazing, wonderful thing, right? I could also tell you anecdotally that in talking with some of my buddies that work in emergency rooms, for example, that they tell me the vast majority of cases that they see after a certain hour at night, like 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever it is, are alcohol related. So whether that is the result of accidents, car accidents, violence, domestic violence, and so forth, alcohol causes a lot of damage to our society. And sometimes this can result in intergenerational damage. Children that are living in a home with alcoholism are more likely to experience neglect, abuse, and so forth that can transcend subsequent generations and affect a whole bunch of people. So the bottom line is that alcohol causes a lot of damage in our society. At the same time, I do realize that I don't think we will ever, prohibit the usage of alcohol again. We've tried it before, and alcohol has become part of our culture, part of our American history. So I'm not saying that alcohol is all bad or cannabis is all good, but alcohol tends to result in a lot of problems in our society, and that's something that most of us are aware. Now, in addition to some of those kind of bigger effects, longer effects, or regional effects, we could think about the comparison of how using either alcohol or cannabis might make us feel under these circumstances, moment to moment. So certainly both of them can result in relaxation, which can be a remedy for the current stress that we're dealing with. But in terms of other types of emotions, alcohol can result in emotions that are largely absent in the effects of using cannabis. So what we would classify as negative emotions. So hostility, resentment, jealousy, essentially just feeling more selfish. So, after one beer, a person might feel relaxed, but after a few beers, they might, start bickering or fighting with their loved ones or getting real impatient with the kids and so forth. So those are effects that we don't tend to see with the result of cannabis usage. In fact, cannabis, in addition to resulting in people feeling more relaxed, also tends to induce feelings of peacefulness and feelings of kind of completeness and increased sociability for other folks. I call this a humanitarianism effect, and we're actually doing some research on it at the moment to test some of these ideas. But cannabis tends to result in the motivation to engage in more pro-social behaviors and feeling more pro-social sensations towards others. Whereas alcohol, it's volatile. It could be one way or the other. So in terms of how we treat those loved ones around us, cannabis is more likely to cause us to treat those people with more care and more tenderness and with more patience, and probably the way that they deserve, right? At the same time, we could think about how cannabis affects our behavioral functioning versus the effects of alcohol on our behavioral functioning. And certainly both of them can impair behavioral functioning. So if you're hammering a nail, for example, you're going to be more likely to hit your thumb being intoxicated from cannabis or alcohol than if you were not intoxicated by either, okay? So that is something to take into consideration. In terms of the latency of intoxication, I think that cannabis offers a shorter latency of intoxication on average than alcohol. So, as we tend to drink more alcohol, more beers, more wine or whatever, we become increasingly less able to drive effectively and safely. And that tends to last for many, many hours, oftentimes still the next day. Now, with regard to cannabis users, at least among regular users, they will oftentimes feel able to drive and able to drive safely after sometimes even minutes or an hour. So when considering the possibility of engaging in emergency actions under these current circumstances where we might have to drive out and get supplies, or we might need to, help folks and be able, at least cannabis offers the ability to not be intoxicated for such a long amount of time. Now, some other considerations that we might make are how either cannabis or alcohol affects other aspects of our behavioral functioning. So, for example, what we choose to eat. What cannabis does is causes an intense focus on what we do. And sometimes when we direct that towards our food, it can result in both outcomes, right? So we've all heard of the munchies. Many of us have experienced the munchies where you're eating way too much of stuff that seems like it would be good at the time, only later to regret it. But it doesn't always have to be that way. As I said, cannabis causes a heightened focus on what one is doing. So if you could transition the desire to eat junk food to something that's healthy, cannabis can help you enjoy healthy food, okay? Now, with regard to the effects of alcohol on our food decision and consumptions, it tends to be the case that alcohol results in us eating more junk food most of the time, okay? So very rarely have I drunk some alcohol and wanted to go out and eat a really healthy meal. It's usually the stuff that we shouldn't be eating, so pizzas and hamburgers and french fries, and everybody knows, right? So in terms of the trade-offs and how either alcohol or cannabis affects our macronutrient consumption decisions, I do think that cannabis can be used as a tool to enhance dietary changes and to help achieve dietary goals, whereas alcohol usually results in us making bad decisions in terms of what we're eating. Now, along those lines, we could think about how either alcohol or cannabis affects our ability to engage in movement, or just to engage in exercise, for example. We all know that exercise is important. It will increase our ability to defend ourselves against viruses and other types of ailments and so forth. So in terms of the comparison of using alcohol or cannabis, I know that there are many, probably hundreds, probably thousands of professional athletes that actually use cannabis to enhance their focus on their training. So, MMA fighters are notorious for using cannabis, long distance runners are notorious, swimmers and so forth. So there are many athletes out there that use cannabis effectively to hone in and focus and enhance the training on their particular craft. Now, with regard to alcohol usage, I think it generally tends to deter our ability to engage in athleticism. So I don't know about you, but I have very rarely had a few beers and wanted to go out and run 1,000 steps up a stadium, or to go work out for 2 hours. And that is just not going to happen. Usually it results in the opposite. So, you drink a few beers and your ability to do anything really quickly plummets. Now, when considering the trade-offs of using either cannabis or alcohol to either reduce your stress or reduce your levels of depression, or perhaps to remedy other types of health conditions, it is important to consider all these things. So the potential long-term impact on our bodies, on our minds, as well as how it might affect our day-to-day or daily interactions with other people and our health decisions in general. Now, if you like this type of content, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons and sharing our videos with as many people as possible, particularly the people that you love the most in this world. Also consider becoming a patron or even a donor to the University of New Mexico's Medical Cannabis Research Fund, which I established in 2016 to be able to obtain the type of funding that I needed to conduct the type of research that you need to make sound medical decisions. I've devoted my career basically to serving you. So I just want everybody to know out there that at the University of New Mexico's MCRF, we are working hard every single day to conduct cutting-edge research in so many different directions, using so many different types of research designs. It is truly, truly exciting. And I thank you for giving me the motivation and the true, clear purpose in what I need to do and how best to devote my life to enhancing our humanity. I'm doing so because we're all in this world together, and I truly believe that we need to take care of each other, because together we are changing the world.